praise His holy name. Would you open your Bibles, please, this morning to 1 Samuel 23. We'll get to that a little bit later, but I want you to go ahead and find your way over there. 1 Samuel 23, and we'll be looking at 1 Samuel 23 and 24. You know, if we've learned anything from David, we have learned that the choices that we make in life determine the character of our hearts. It's kind of like termites in a house that compromises will eat away at our character until there's going to be all that's left is a complete collapse. And faithfulness and our everyday choices is something that strengthens our character, just like the threads in a rope combined, they come together to form a rope. That's what our character does. And we'll see this negatively illustrated in the life of David in that story, which everybody's familiar with, how that his character failed in the experience there with Bathsheba, and it all ricocheted and spinned on out. It's interesting, by the way, it comes to mind how many times what we tend to remember, and this isn't a good thing about our human nature, we tend to remember the bad rather than the good. All the great good that David did. In fact, we're preaching this series of sermons on the fact that he's a man after God's own heart. But one of the things for which David is so much remembered is the fact of his sin with Bathsheba and all that was involved with that. But we're going to see here this morning in particular this matter of character being reflected to the heart through the choices. And we're going to see here some choices that deepened his character and made him more a man after God's own heart. But before we get to those choices in the life of David, I want to kind of paint the scene again of what all's been going on. At the end of 1 Samuel chapter 23, there's this dramatic scene of Saul being in pursuit of David, and Saul was on one side of the mountain and David was on the other side of the mountain. And Saul had divided his men up so that they're coming around the mountain. Have you heard that song? I just thought about that when I was preaching. It's not even Christmas. Here, y'all shouldn't have distracted me like that. And so it's really not a good thing what Saul's doing. Shouldn't be laughing. So Saul had divided his men up so that, how can I say it? Saul's got his men coming around on this side. I'm not going to get through this sermon if I don't say it some other way. And he's got his men coming through on this side of the mountain. And David there, of course, is in a bad situation. Saul's coming together after David in what might be called a pincher maneuver. And David and his men may not have known it, but they were in deep, deep trouble. Well, look at 1 Samuel 23, verse 26b, and going through 28a, where the scripture tells us this. So Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men to capture them. And as that was happening, notice what happened. A messenger came to Saul saying, "Hurry and come, for the Philistines have made a raid against the land." So Saul returned from pursuing after David and went against the Philistines. I mean, God was at work. I mean, there was seemingly no way out of this particular situation. So David and his men, what happens to them? They didn't just sit back and wait, well, let's just sit here and wait and he can get back and he can get right to us. David and his men, they took advantage of the little bit of reprieve and they headed to the caves and the hills and En-Gedi. I remember 21 and a half years ago, roughly, Terry and I went to Israel, and as we're going on there with the tour guide, and oh, how wonderful it is just to have all these places pointed out to you, just to see them historically, experience them. Well, that's where they're headed there. The elevation, the fresh water, and the rocky terrain made this a good place to hide. Now, as you move on into chapter 24, Saul and his army, they've already gotten through with defeating the Philistines in battle there. And so now again, what did they do? They turned their attention once again back toward David. And when they learned that David and his men were in En-Gedi, Saul gathered 3,000 men and headed off in pursuit of David and his men. Now notice what happens then in 1 Samuel 24, verses 3 through 7. And he, that is Saul, came to the sheepfolds by the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. And the men, it's like this. Now, get it in your mind. They're like, whoa. I mean, God was working before by getting him away to the Philistine. God really working here is what all the men are figuring out. And the men of David said to David, here is the day of which the Lord said to you, behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you. Then David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Verse 5. And afterward, David's heart struck him. That's a way of saying that David's conscience really bothered him. Why? Because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he, Saul, is the Lord's anointed. So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. Well, this morning I want you to see from this particular passage choices that reveal a person after God's own heart. Choices that reveal a person after God's own heart. Of course, we've been looking at David, and we're looking at him again as the example of someone who does have a heart for God. The first thing I want you to notice this morning is this. You choose to submit to authority rather than pursue selfish expediency. Now, would you not agree? King Saul is in a very, very vulnerable position. I mean, he's gone into what is obviously this very big cave to do his business, shall we say. And he's in a place now where David, whom he's been pursuing to try to kill, David and his men are hiding out in this cave where he goes in there to use the restroom. And so our text tells us there's this little, so to speak, argument that begins to take place in the cave. There's a difference of opinion between David on the one hand and the rest of his men on what they should do with the fact that Saul is there within their reach. And David's men interpreted the circumstances as, you know what? God has delivered Saul, King Saul, into our hands. And so the men in the cave, they just believed that God had delivered Saul, if you will, up on a silver platter to them. And so in their minds, what they're thinking, wow, this Saul, he's been chasing us all this time, so what's it going to mean? In just a moment, we'll have all that taken care of so that all the being chased, all the hiding out, all of the waiting, the exile, all of that's going to be over in just a moment because what they were doing, they knew, of course, David's going to go ahead and strike him down, and so they encouraged David to kill Saul. But David saw the incident very, very differently here. To David, as he looked at what was going on here, this was really a test. The question for David was this, as he really paused, as he looked at it. Would God overlook the fact, that is to say, would David overlook the fact that Saul was God's anointed so that he, David, could exploit the situation for his own purposes? And what that was, make no mistake about it, that was a character-defining moment for David. And so what had David done, as we read from the Scriptures? David had crept toward Saul, and when he reached Saul, he quietly cut off a piece of Saul's robe. We don't really know. The Bible doesn't really tell us here. Maybe Saul had kind of set his robe off to the side for just a moment there. Regardless, we're told that David was conscience-stricken over the fact of his even having cut the robe of Saul. And I suspect that what's going through David's mind is he's kind of entering up to it, and it's like, hey, it could be real close to taking his life. But I suppose what's going on even in this treatment of Saul, that he begins to kind of become conscience-stricken because he's believing that symbolically he was rebelling against the king. And David knew that any kind of rebellion was wrong, even if it were just minor. And David understood something. He knew that his actions were sending a message, and they were setting a precedent for those who, by the way, one day going to follow him. He's going to be the king one day, right? He'd been promised by God. He's going to be the next king, promised through Samuel. And so he knew that his actions were sending a message about how a king should be treated. And apparently, though, the men weren't just satisfied with that. And so the men just continued, apparently, to urge David to go ahead and strike Saul. But notice again, I read it to you a moment ago, but notice again David's response to what the men wanted him to do as we read there in 1 Samuel 24, verses 6 through 7a. He, David, said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed," that is Saul, "to put out my hand against him, seeing he, Saul, is the Lord's anointed." So David persuaded, and that's the idea there of rebuked. He rebuked his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. Now again, I tried to point it out there. The word there in Hebrew stresses the forcefulness of David's rebuke of the men. David showed respect to earthly authority because he respected God's divine authority. In Romans 13, we're going to see later, of course, in the New Testament, that Paul teaches us that we are to respect and honor the office of those who are over us. We can disagree with our authorities, but we should do so in a respectful way. And we can apply this in marriage. Husbands and wives should honor each other. They should speak to each other in respectful ways, even when they get frustrated with one another. They should speak about each other in ways that show their spouse in a positive light. And Paul tells wives, especially, that they are to respectfully encourage their husbands to take a leadership role in the home. And there's also the matter, according to the Scriptures, that children are to honor their parents, and that they are to do that as a way of showing their respect unto God. And children show honor to their parents how? By the way that they talk to their parents, by the way that they obey their parents. That also applies to the schools. It also applies to our places of employment. God has established authorities in order to keep order in society. And God tells us to trust in His wisdom. We may not like those who are in authority over us. It doesn't matter. Our job is to show honor and respect to the office of the person because we respect and honor the Lord. Here's the second thing this morning. Number 2, choose to demonstrate respect and love over hate and resentment. Now, I want you to try to put yourself in David's shoes. Saul's been after him. Saul has thrown spear at him. Saul has really been nasty to David. And so, from a human point of view, David had every right to hate King Saul from an earthly perspective. Yet David chose what? In the moments we just described here a moment ago here, when he's there in the cave with him and all he did is just cut the robe and he didn't kill him. Yet David chose to show love and mercy to the king. And here's how David interacted with King Saul. He called Saul Lord and acknowledged him as king. He bowed and prostrated himself before Saul as a sign of respect and honor. He showed Saul, in fact, the corner of Saul's robe, the evidence that Saul, you know what? I could have killed you. I didn't read all about that here. That's also in the narrative here. But he didn't kill him, of course. And he declared his own innocence to Saul. What had David done? David honored the king publicly. He showed mercy and grace to his enemy. By the way, that's the same thing Jesus did. That's what Jesus did. Jesus prayed for those who put him on the cross. He spoke with grace to the man beside him being crucified next to him. And I don't know if you've thought about this, but think about this. Paul reminds us that when Jesus died on the cross, and he's dying there for you and for me, he's dying for us while we were, as Paul describes us, still as enemies of God. And Jesus instructed us to love our enemies, to pray for those who persecute us. You know, the thing about the Bible and looking at Jesus just gets right in the middle of us doing life the way we would normally want to do it, right? Because it's just not natural for us to be that way and do that way. I mean, any one of us in a heartbeat, just in our day-to-day lives, we can fall away from do that. It's the natural thing in the world, most natural thing in the world for us to want to hate our enemy. But Jesus doesn't want us to take the natural course. He wants us to follow his example. You know, maybe this will help us. The truth is, have y'all ever heard this phrase? If you haven't, get it in your mind and mark it down. Hurting people hurt others. You ever heard that before? Well, get it down in your mind. Because the truth is that most people who are hurting other people, they are the kind of people who are acting in response to hurts and aches and pains that they've felt in their own lives. And Jesus wants us to see and respond to our enemy's pain, not the offense that they may have committed against us. And so I want to ask you this morning, is there somebody in your life, and all of us have lived here long enough, I think that there at least there has to be maybe more than one along the way, and maybe we've already properly dealt with it. But I want to ask you even right now, is there someone in your life who has caused great pain in your life, has brought great aching in your life, someone where you need to look past your own ache and your own hurt and see the ache and the pain in the heart of your enemy? Jesus knows that we win only when we've conquered hatred with love. And he knows that we're only going to know joy when we have let go of our need to punish and destroy others and choose to love people in his strength. I want you to think for a minute. Whom are the kind of people that have really impacted the world in the most positive way? Are they the people who are just so angry? Are they the people who've just kind of run over people all the time? No. Those people who do that, to be sure, they may be able to gain some wealth by their bully attitude and their force of intimidation, and maybe some wealth that they have behind them that allows them to do some of the things that they do in their connections with other people. And they may experience some material blessing or be looked at, maybe even looked up to for a little while here. But in the end, those are not the people who make the positive life-changing impact. The people, you know this, who really make the most positive impact in this world are those who choose to love rather than to hate. And we can do the same. Not in our own power to love, but only in the power of God's love, his agape love. And only that love as it's evidenced as a fruit of the Spirit. Here's a third thing then this morning. Choose patiently. Choose to patiently wait on God's timing rather than impulsively decide to do things your own way. Now, I think this final choice is evident, but it's not explicitly pointed out as you read the passage here. David chose to wait on God's perfect timing rather than just to try to go ahead and do things in his own strength and try to make things happen. But many people live their lives this way. If they see what they want, don't worry about anybody else. They're just going to simply take it. And they certainly don't give any thought, obviously, to the way that actions like that are eroding their character. I want to remind you of something we need to be reminded of over and over as we study the life of David. God had promised David, David, you're going to be king. And that promise, though, for David, he said, God, I thought you said I was going to be king. Saul's chasing me all the time. That promise had been held up by King Saul. But what did David do? That's what we're seeing in this passage this morning. David chose to wait for God to bring the promise to pass in his timing. You see, David understood something. He understood that God's delays are never because God can't do something, but rather it's the matter of God's delays are because the timing is not yet right. And when we push the issue, we can really mess things up. Solomon gave us the proper philosophy for life in Proverbs 3, verses 5 and 6. You know the verses. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make straight your paths. And David is demonstrating this kind of trust in God. I mean, picture yourself that you're in the cave. This guy's been after you. He's had your number. He's been trying to kill you, and he would have killed you. That's why he was even there on that particular occasion. And yet Saul didn't do it. King David didn't kill him. He waited. He trusted in God. What did he do? David remained, so to speak, in the waiting room of God, even though he could have broken out. David knew that God's way, that God's blessing was worth the wait. And a person's impact in life is determined by their character. And their character is formed by the decisions that they make every day. If you heard me say that, say amen. Our character is determined by the decisions that we make every day. Where you choose to spend your money, that's a choice. What gets the priority in your time and in your attention, that's a choice. How you choose to respond to frustrations and disappointments and the anger in your life. How diligently you choose to develop and to guard your relationships. The times that you must choose between doing what God says very clearly. You know what God would have you to do in your particular circumstance. The times when you must choose between doing what God says and what it is you may selfishly want to do, that you may want to rationalize away why you want to do it anyway, or because maybe somebody else has told you, oh no, you need to do it this way. You got to choose whether you're going to do it God's way or the other way. And every morning when you decide whether you're going to make time for God on this day or whether you're too busy for more important things. And when you have the choice between doing what is right and doing what's easy. You see, folks, the truth is we make these decisions every week. We make them probably hundreds of times every week. In fact, we're doing them so much that most of the time, we don't even realize that these are choices that we're making. We don't stop and get in tune with the Spirit of God enough to notice that. But each time that we make a decision, the decision that we make is either strengthening our character or it's eroding that character. I always get a little bit concerned when I try to do this or anybody else. But you think about trying to sum up what this whole thing about our relationship with God is all about. We know a lot of things. We know what Jesus said. But I want to relate it to what's going on here and what we're learning from David. When it's all said and done, God's not going to measure us by the words that we profess. God's not even going to measure us by our having mastered so much particular information. No, what God's going to do when it's all said and done, He's going to look at the character of our heart. For it's our heart, our character, that determines that very important part of us. It's that character within us that will disclose who really trusts God and who doesn't. Our heart, our character, our faithfulness is determined one decision at a time. I want to ask you today, did you come in here today with some particular thing that's been weighing on you through the week, or maybe it's been weighing on you for a while, and you've been trying to figure out what you're going to do, and you got to make a decision. And maybe already in your mind you've been rationalizing why you need to make one decision when all the while you know God doesn't want you to do that. I want to ask you, would you choose to obey God? Would you just decide maybe that you want to get back on track to make the decisions that are going to honor Him?